Welcome to Warfront Global. This channel studies the deeper economic and strategic forces shaping global events. If you value careful analysis and long-term thinking, consider subscribing to the channel. And tell us something interesting in the comments as well. Where in the world are you watching from today? It is always fascinating to see how far these discussions travel. Now, let us begin. Wars often change in dramatic ways. A military breakthrough occurs, a government collapses, a ceasefire agreement is announced. But sometimes, the direction of a conflict changes quietly through economic leverage rather than battlefield victories. That may be what is happening around the Strait of Hormuz today. This narrow passage between Iran and Oman is one of the most strategically important energy routes in the world. Roughly 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply passes through it. Every day, enormous tankers move through this corridor carrying the energy that powers global industry. For decades, the system behind this flow has been simple. Oil is traded in US dollars. Countries that need energy convert their currencies into dollars, pay producers, and receive shipments. This structure has supported the global financial system for more than half a century. Now imagine a scenario where some shipments passing through this choke point begin operating under a different rule. Instead of converting local currencies into dollars, buyers convert them into Yuan. Instead of relying entirely on traditional financial channels, transactions move through alternative systems. At first, this might involve only a few shipments, a small number of contracts. But financial systems rarely change suddenly. They change through precedent. The first transaction proves it is possible. The second proves it works. And the third convinces others to try the same approach. This is why that single sentence about yuan payments attracted attention across global markets. It suggested that the conflict may be evolving beyond military confrontation. Because when a strategic energy route becomes linked to currency decisions, the question is no longer only about ships or missiles. The question becomes who controls the rules of global trade. And that question may shape the future of the world economy long after the conflict itself ends. How the dollar became the currency of oil. To understand why the recent discussion around yuan payments is attracting so much attention, it is necessary to go back more than 50 years. The modern global energy system did not always revolve around the US dollar. That structure was built gradually during the early 1970s, during a period of major economic uncertainty. The world had just experienced an oil shock. Inflation was rising in many countries. Governments were searching for stability in global trade. In 1974, the United States reached a strategic understanding with Saudi Arabia. The agreement was simple but extremely powerful. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exports exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide military protection and security cooperation to the kingdom. Other oil-producing nations soon followed the same model. As a result, nearly all global oil transactions began to take place in dollars. This arrangement eventually became known as the Petrodollar system. At first glance, it may appear to be just a technical financial rule, but in reality, it reshaped the global economy. Under the system, any country that needed to import oil first had to obtain US dollars. European nations converted euros into dollars. Asian economies exchanged their local currencies for dollars. Even countries in Africa and Latin America followed the same process. Energy trade created constant demand for the dollar. This demand had powerful consequences. Because governments across the world needed dollar reserves to secure their energy supplies, the United States gained an unusual financial advantage. It could issue debt in its own currency while knowing that global demand for dollars would remain strong. This helped keep borrowing costs relatively low for the US government. It also strengthened the dollar's position as the dominant global reserve currency. Another important effect appeared in the international banking system. Financial institutions built payment networks designed primarily for dollar transactions. The most well-known of these networks is the global financial messaging system operated by SWIFT. Through this system, banks around the world could transfer payments quickly and securely, most often using dollars. Over time, the combination of energy trade and financial infrastructure created a powerful economic cycle. Oil demanded dollars. Dollars flowed through international banks. Central banks accumulated dollar reserves. Global finance began to revolve around this structure. Because of this, the petrodollar system became more than a currency choice. It became a foundation of modern economic stability. However, systems that appear permanent often evolve slowly beneath the surface. In recent years, several countries have started exploring ways to reduce their reliance on dollar transactions. Some governments worry about sanctions risk. Others simply want more flexibility in trade. China has been one of the most active countries in this effort. Beijing has invested heavily in financial infrastructure designed to support international payments in its own currency. One of the most important examples is the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, often called CIPS. This system allows banks to process cross-border transactions using Chinese yuan. Although it is still smaller than Western financial networks, its usage has been growing steadily. China has also expanded trade agreements that encourage the use of yuan in international commerce. Energy transactions, infrastructure investments, and bilateral currency arrangements have all played a role in this gradual expansion. Until recently, however, one major obstacle remained. Most global oil trade still relied on the dollar. As long as energy transactions remain dollar-based, countries would continue to hold dollar reserves to secure their energy supplies. This is why the situation surrounding the Strait of Hormuz has drawn such attention. If oil shipments moving through one of the world's most critical energy routes begin accepting yuan payments, even in limited amounts, it could introduce a new precedent into global markets. That precedent would not immediately replace the dollar, but it could create something new, a second option. And once an alternative option exists in global finance, economic behavior often begins to adapt around it. This is the possibility that analysts are now watching closely, because the next phase of the story may not depend only on oil production or military strategy. It may depend on which currency begins to move through the world's most important energy routes. If oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz begins to move under a different currency arrangement, the consequences will not appear overnight. Global financial systems do not collapse suddenly. They evolve through gradual changes in incentives, behavior, and market structure. The first stage of such a shift would likely appear in the behavior of governments and central banks. Countries that depend heavily on imported energy must maintain reserves that allow them to purchase oil quickly when markets tighten. For decades, this requirement meant holding US dollar reserves. These reserves ensured that energy purchases could be completed without delays in currency conversion. However, if a portion of global oil trade begins accepting Chinese yuan, some importing countries may begin adjusting their reserve strategies. Central banks might slowly increase their yuan holdings in order to maintain flexibility when purchasing energy from Gulf producers. This adjustment would not replace the dollar immediately. Instead, it would introduce diversification. Financial diversification often appears harmless at first. Yet over time, even small changes in reserve allocation can influence currency demand across the global economy. When demand for a currency gradually declines relative to alternatives, exchange rates can experience downward pressure. At the same time, borrowing costs may adjust as global investors shift capital toward different assets. For the United States, the dollar's global role has long provided a powerful financial advantage. Because the currency is widely used in trade and reserves, global investors consistently purchase dollar-denominated assets, including government bonds. This demand helps keep borrowing costs relatively low. If global reserve patterns slowly diversify, that advantage could weaken over time. Borrowing may become slightly more expensive, and financial markets may adjust to a more multipolar currency environment. However, the most important consequence may not be financial, but geopolitical. Currencies are not merely economic tools. They shape influence within the global system. For decades, the dollar-based energy trade has given the United States a unique position in global finance. Many international transactions pass through dollar clearing networks, and financial sanctions often rely on access to those systems. If alternative settlement networks expand, countries may gain additional options when conducting trade. China has already invested heavily in financial infrastructure designed to support this possibility. Its payment network, the cross-border interbank payment system, allows cross-border transactions in yuan and continues to grow in volume. If oil trade begins using that system more frequently, participation in the yuan financial ecosystem could expand alongside energy markets. Yet even in this scenario, it is important to understand that the dollar would not disappear from global finance. Currency systems rarely replace one another completely. Instead, the world often shifts toward a balance where multiple currencies operate simultaneously. The dollar may remain dominant for many years, while the yuan gradually expands its presence in specific sectors, particularly energy trade involving Asian markets. The key transformation, therefore, may not be a sudden collapse of the existing system, but the emergence of a second major pathway within global finance. For businesses, investors, and policymakers, this possibility carries important implications. Energy markets influence transportation costs, manufacturing prices, and global supply chains. Currency movements affect trade balances, investment flows, and financial stability. When both systems interact, economic planning becomes more complex. Entrepreneurs and business leaders often focus on immediate market conditions, yet the deeper forces shaping the global economy operate over decades. The developments around the Strait of Hormuz illustrate how geopolitical events can accelerate structural changes that were already forming beneath the surface. If access to critical energy routes begins linking trade with alternative financial systems, the world may be entering a period where economic influence becomes more distributed. The battlefield headlines may eventually fade, but the financial precedents established during moments of crisis can reshape the global economy for generations. And the quiet question now emerging is this: was the conflict in the Gulf only a regional military confrontation? Or was it the beginning of a slow transformation in the currency that powers the world's energy trade?